Welcome to Best Practices for Active Directory on AWS. My name is Mike Cotton, and I'm a solutions architect for public sector. All right. Okay, all right. Okay, so today we're going to talk about Active Directory in the cloud, how it's used, your deployment options, which ones to choose from, and some trusts, best practices around establishing trusts, either using AWS managed Active Directory services or using your own Active Directories that you probably don't, maybe you don't extend, but you build new in AWS. I'd also like to dispel a couple of myths. I think that the important thing to note is that 80%, maybe 75% of what I'm going to talk about today really is stuff that you do every day. So I wanted to kind of dispel the myth when you hear AWS and Active Directory, everybody goes, wow, how do I do that, right? Before we get started, I want to talk about what we have as far as managed offerings. We have simple Active Directory, which is a Samba-based Active Directory, fully compliant, Kerberos, workstations, group policy objects, no trust relationships, and really is for 5,000 or fewer users. You can't extend a schema with this one either. Now, when it comes to the managed Active Directory services, that is actually Active Directory Enterprise Edition. And when we talk about 5,000 users or less, what we're really talking about is, am I actually sourcing identities within this Active Directory? Am I standing it up? And am I putting 5,000 users in it? And if that's the case, then there's a limit. It's not necessarily 5,000. It could be more or less, depending on concurrent usage. But when you use it in a trusted model where you're actually providing a trust relationship back to on-premises, and you're using it as a kind of a resourced forest, if you have 50,000 users on-premises, we'll support the authentication and pass-through for that. Okay? There's some limitations with that with respect to what you can and can't do with it. There's some announcements coming with regards to some features that are going to be released. I'll go through those as we go through the presentation. But it's one-way trust, two-way trust, schema extensions. Now, here's where I start dispelling some myths, right? So when I look at this slide, I try to put myself in my customer's shoes, and I'm thinking, I'm moving to the cloud, and I've really got to make this journey? And I look at customers from two different perspectives. I think there are some customers that are already making this journey today. When you refer to things like refactor, especially down at the bottom here when you're talking about different types of authentication processes like SAML, Web Identity, OIDC, OAuth. Most organizations are looking at these things today. So this shouldn't be really new. But in the case of being new, when you think about the different types of authentication that you have going on in your environment today, and this is where I'm trying to dispel some of that myth, right? I have end-user application authentication processes, right? And that could be Windows-based, it could be Kerberos, it could be NTLM. I have applications that reside on top of that. A lot of Oracle users here. Oracle doesn't really join an Active Directory. It uses Active Directory from an LDAP perspective, but if you put WebLogic in front of it, you could do SAML, right? And you could do SSO, and you could support many different directories. So as we dispel the myths here, don't think of the big bad moving to the cloud as going to be a big challenge from an authentication perspective. A lot of these things you're doing already. You're looking at how do I authenticate users to my network devices, looking at how do I authenticate users to my servers for administration purposes. You're looking at how do you authenticate your users from an application perspective. And that doesn't change when you move to the cloud. And a lot of you, kind of show of hands, who's doing SAML and OAuth or OIDC today? So when you think about moving to the cloud, flex the same muscle. For those that don't or aren't using that today, it's not a huge uplift. I think your organizations probably will be looking at it in the near future. So how does authentication work in Active Directory? So workstations authenticate, username and password. Machine is the username, and the password associated with that machine account gets changed every 30 days, saves one password for a total of 60 days. But I'm essentially authenticating a workstation I'm getting a Kerberos ticket for that workstation. I can use that Kerberos ticket or the NTLM token on that, from that workstation authentication process to make decisions based upon you accessing a resource from a specific device, right? You can access a resource only if you're logged into that workstation. So workstations authenticate the same way users do. Users authenticate the same way workstations do. Kerberos, unlike NTLM, is a client referral process, very close to the way SAML works. Everybody understands what client referral means? The client is the one that establishes the path of authentication through the request process. So down at the bottom here, I have an example where I'm authenticating. Actually, let's stay at the top one, stay at the middle one. User authenticates to Active Directory. It's a Kerberos ticket. It's a ticket granting ticket. It's verifying your identity. User goes and accesses an app, maybe a SQL app, maybe a SharePoint app backed up by SQL. In a Kerberos world, if you don't have a service granting ticket for that resource, you're requested to go get one. If you have to go get one, you've got to make a call to Active Directory. You've got to look for the service principal name of that device. In this case, it could be a web server with a SQL backend. And you're going to get a ticket granting ticket, and you're going to present it back to that service, and you're going to be authenticated. Everybody understand that concept? SAML's the same way, right? I go to if it's a relying party initiated authentication process, you go to the app. There's no authentication token in your header, the URL stream. It says, go here, 302, redirect to my identity provider, and authenticate. And then present back to me the results of that. How does that work in the cloud? Different picture, different colors, but it works the same way. Right here, we're using MS SQL, using either a customer purpose-built SQL implementation or Amazon managed relational database services to support that SQL requirement, but we're still doing the same things. SAML front end, Kerberos constraint delegation on the backside, all predicated on the user authenticating through Active Directory. Does that make sense to everybody? So we've made the journey. I'll just back up real quick here. We've made the journey from on-premises to the cloud. And really, the only thing that's changed is the colors of the applications themselves. And these can be services that you build on EC2. How many guys actually use AWS here today? Great. I have a habit of using a lot of acronyms, and sometimes I don't back them up. So everybody knows what EC2 means and VPC. Great. So these could be customer-built EC2 managed services, or these could be AWS managed services like relational database services. Okay. Deployment options. Again, you guys do this today. How many people here work with Active Directory on an everyday basis? How many sites in your organizations do not have domain controllers in them? Let's throw out a number. Most of them? You got all your users sitting out in these remote locations, maybe there's 25 or 30 people there. Does it warrant a domain controller? Probably not, right? Because with purchasing the hardware and the licensing becomes the management costs, right? I've got to patch it, I've got to configure, okay. So the first option is don't deploy domain controllers into AWS. Set up your account, do your connectivity, your direct connect, your VPN over the internet, provision your resources or your services in AWS that require Active Directory, but don't extend Active Directory out there from a lift or build new domain controllers in your VPC. Just change your VPC DHCP options to point to the domain controllers that you want those services to authenticate to. It supports domain join through the user data process on an EC2 launch configuration. It supports authentication, but you are going over a connection, a VPN connection over a DX or over the internet. It could, depending on the load, you could suffer some latency. And if you had an issue with the connection for 20 or 30 minutes, everything in your VPC either could fail or be off limits to you. So we say, bring your domain controllers to your VPC. The most flexibility, but you're still managing this yourself, right? You're patching it. It's like saying, I have a new site, and I need to bring domain services out there. You don't have to provision. You could do license included Windows, and you could build your own domain controllers on those, but you still have to manage them. Everybody familiar with that process? Bringing your domain controllers out. So when I say, I'm demystifying this for you, Forget we're calling this AWS. We're just calling it another. If you guys are here for the last presentation, you kept using the term, this is just another data center for you. This is just another facility, a data center, and just another enclave, just another place where you have services. If you take the AWS out of it, it kind of takes the scariness away. You could bring your domain controllers out, and then you could change your DHCP options on your VPC subnets to be able to point to those domain controllers, but you still have to manage it. If you guys have any questions as we're going through this, please don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask. The third option, well, it's not really the third option, it's the fourth option we're going to talk about as it relates to the EC2, or excuse me, Windows or Active Directory on EC2. But the third option here is AWS Managed Active Directory, right? It is an Active Directory server. It's two of them. It's in a VPC. We manage it. It's a 3-click implementation. It supports seamless domain join. It does require an implementation in each VPC. It does require the services that you're going to be integrating with, this authentication method, that they're in the same VPC. So it can get a bit cumbersome when you start thinking about, well, I do have a lot of VPCs, right? Maybe I do applications specifically by VPCs, so that segregation, you know, app 1 in one VPC, app 2 and app 3 in another. And we're making some changes that I'll announce at the end of this that kind of gets away from that. It also supports integration with our workspace products, our work doc products, and our workspaces, work docs, and workmail, Chime, and QuickSight, right? But the limitations are the same. You could build a standalone or connect it to your Active Directory with trusts. And the standalone concept is something we'll talk about here in a second. Yeah? No, it's a typo. It's two domain controllers per VPC in different AZs or different subnets in different AZs. I thought it was going to be a long-winded question. You caught a typo in my presentation. Good for you. Yeah. Okay, so how many of you use Managed Active Directory? Okay, so the ones that haven't, we don't give you domain admin rights. We give you rights over an OU, right? We delegate full rights over that OU. We do allow you to do scheme extensions through an LDIF import, or there's a wizard in there which allows you to drop your LDIF file. I would recommend that you go through Microsoft support to get your LDIF file validated. And anytime I've ever done an Active Directory extension on that, on AD, been doing this for a long time, I recommend that you go through Microsoft to be able to validate your LDIF file, okay? So your responsibilities really here are just to administer it, right? Using ADUC, Active Directory users in computers. It does support two-way trust. It does support one-way trust. It does support Kerberos delegation, constraint delegation. So here's where it gets a bit interesting. So we talked about the various different methods in which you can deploy Active Directory within your AWS infrastructure. You can just change the VPC settings from a DHCP perspective to point back on premises once you have that network connectivity and those firewalls set up, or the security group set up. You can bring Active Directory domain controllers into your VPC. Again, it's just a matter of building a Windows server on EC2, making sure that your network connectivity is there, make sure your security groups, your firewalls are set correctly, and then configuring your DHCP options on your VPC. Very familiar with that? You know, domain name, suffix, Win server, Win's node type, right? And then I can actually do a DC promo and build my domain controller infrastructure within my single or multiple VPCs, depending on how you have them connected together from a network perspective. And if you drop all the way down to the bottom, there's the option of syncing users, right? There's the option of actually building that Active Directory the same way you would build it if you were just doing an extension and replicating, but actually building an Active Directory and syncing users over. It's a pretty interesting use case here. There are no trust relationships in this scenario. There really can't be, because how do you have users existing in both locations or both forced at the same time? And theoretically you could, but then you'd have a lot of confusion if you did a trust relationship and you were trying to figure out how to route suffixes from a name-suffix routing table perspective in Active Directory. But this really gives you the option to be able to take those credentials, especially in a PIV world, right? We have PIV and CAC and smart card, and you're wanting to give people access to resources that sit more closer to the perimeter, but you don't necessarily want to extend your Active Directory to that perimeter, right? So what you're doing in this situation is you're actually creating another identity store, and in theory you're taking on the responsibility of managing that, but if you're doing an automated sync process where you provision, deprovision, and it just happens across the whatever tool you're using, and you're automatically doing that PIV UPN association, so the UPN suffix on your PIV card or your smart card or your CAC card is associated with the UPN suffix on your Active Directory account. As you sync that over, what you're actually doing is you're building a repository that will support the same authentication methods from a PIV perspective, CAC and smart card, in this closer to the edge directory service, right? So if this was compromised, you wouldn't run the risk of actually compromising your internal Active Directory. How many of you guys are familiar with the kind of red forest concept or the ESAE concept with administering Active Directory and having two directories, one administer the other, but no trust relationships between them? This is the same, you familiar with it? It's the same kind of concept, right? I'm taking my users and I'm allowing them to use their same credentials to log into services that I'm offering, and maybe even in a perimeter perspective where you're mixing internal and external users using the same credentials. I don't have my thing on me, but those PIV card, CAC card, smart cards use the same credentials they use to log in internally, but I'm not mixing the two directories. Anybody not understand what I'm talking about? Yeah, go ahead.
So you talk about having two separate domains of force?
Yeah, so two separate.
So I have users in one force that are trying to use services in the other force, and vice versa?
Well, I mean, theoretically, yes, but I mean, if it depends on the nature as you move from internal to near edge or near external. Most organizations don't want to extend internal Active Directories because if they're compromised, you get the pass the hash and the credential theft that allows somebody to walk through your environment. If I'm standing up a directory to authenticate users in a near edge or edge location where I don't necessarily want to bring my internal domain controller services or authentication services out there, it's a separate Kerberos domain, so it's a separate forest. I'm syncing users over there, and I'm allowing them to use their same credentials in this near edge location. So think of a VPN solution, right? I want people to use a VPN solution to come through an edge location, but maybe I don't want to put my authentication services on that edge because they're closer to a location where they may be compromised. So it really is a concept of taking the credentials that they have today, and if it was username and password, you'd be syncing the password, but since it's two-factor authentication, you're not really syncing anything but the account demographics and the value that's associated with their user principal name and how it matches their alternative UPN suffix on their PIV card. And it allows them to do that authentication using the same credentials. So when they would hit an application and it would say, please provide your credentials, they'd slide their PIV card in, hit their PIN, and it would take them in. It's not completely SSO, but it's reduced sign-on because they have the credentials and they know which ones they need to use to be able to get in there. It's not a different set. Does that explain it better? Okay. So on option number 2, what we're doing here was we're saying that you could build your own directory, or you could use the Microsoft Managed Active Directory, or the Amazon Managed Active Directory service, and create a trust relationship. Everybody familiar with trust relationships? You typically do them at the force level, so you can only have to do them one time. Any questions on this? Okay, so this is kind of a snapshot of a reference architecture. So I think the things that we're not seeing here are the underlying DHCP configuration options, right? So you have these web app and data sitting across two availability zones using a direct connect connection with a VPN over the top of it, and my LDAP and Active Directory servers are sitting in the agency network, in the on-premises network. But what I've done in this situation is I've actually just changed the DHCP option to say, look, for DNS services, for domain services, for WIN services, for WIN type, WIN's node type, I'm actually pointing them to the on-premises Active Directory, maybe 2 or 3 of them, right? So when I go to log in, it's going to long haul back, authenticate, download GPOs, and do that. Now, if you took the Amazon-specific things out of this picture that made it look like a VPC, this could be any remote location that you guys have in your organizations today. And right now, you're making those determinations. Where do I put domain controllers? Well, 75 users or less, or excuse me, or more, is where I put domain controllers. 50 users or more. So that's what this is. This is demystifying bringing domain controller services and authentication services to AWS, because this is really no different than the decisions you're making today. Maybe I've started small, now I'm getting bigger. Maybe that site was 50 users and now it's 150 users. I'm bringing domain controller services out there. So what do you do in that remote facility? You change the DHCP options to say, these are the domain controllers that you need to point to. Maybe you create an Active Directory site. Those users now, those systems now, they point to that Active Directory. In this situation here, all I've done is built 2 Active Directory servers on EC2, changed the DHCP options, and now I'm synchronizing or replicating Active Directory. I've actually brought servers out there, I did a DC promo on them, and they're out there working. So when you think about these options, there's nothing that we're doing here that's really much different than what you're doing from a decision-making process. You know, I think that we're providing you a lot more flexibility and agility, and we're kind of getting doing away with the undifferentiated lifting. You know, you don't have to acquire servers. You can, go in there with your account and say, I need an EC2 instance of this size with a BYL license or license included, and this is what I'm going to install on it. I must encrypt the Elastic Block storage volumes. Click, 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 and I've got servers up and running in no time. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because, once they join to the domain, they have a different name.
Mm-hmm.
And so some tools have, like, the EC2 instance names.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them have the new name,
Mm-hmm.
AWS. And we get a lot of, like, duplicative CIs, like in our CMDB.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, do you have best practices for how you configure the DNS around APs?
Yeah, there actually is pretty good guidance on that, but yours is really more about naming standards. Trying to match the actual name in the console with the NetBIOS name or the.
Well, some tools are using the OS name, and some tools are using the AMI.
Yeah, so any of the tools that like the config, AWS config, that will use the name that's reported in the console or the API calls. So we could take that one offline and talk about that. But let me address a couple of things in relation to that. So it's a lot easier to do a domain join. I shouldn't say a lot easier. It's integrated and automatic to do a domain join when you're using the AWS managed Active Directory. It's basically a little drop down and says, what domain do you want to join? Click, and it will join the domain for you. There's a lot of PowerShell scripts out there in the wild that you can use when you're doing an EC2 launch. You hit the user data, and you put the PowerShell script in there. It joins your domain real easy like. So I just kind of want to demystify that as well, right? Domain joining a system is no different here than it is back at your desk, right? Now, so good question on DNS. So the .2 is always our DNS resolver in AWS. And if I change my DHCP options and I tell my EC2 instance to use a different DNS, how do I integrate the two? And the easiest way to do that is conditional forwarders. It's the easiest way to do it. It's always going to be .2 of that CIDR range for that VPC, and then you just take the region suffix and you put that region suffix as a conditional forward to .2, so 10.0.0.0.2. And I could just, if you have a card, or I'll give you my information afterwards, and I'll send you this. So it's a pretty straightforward process. It's a great question, because if you use other services on your whatever it's your Linux instances or your Windows instances that are actually purporting to talk to an info blocks or an Active Directory DNS other than the AWS DNS, and you start using things like Elastic File Store, right? You're not going to be able to mount these NFS mounts with the name. You have to do it by IP address. So, yeah, you want to be able to integrate DNS for that reason. Okay? Any other questions on this? Okay, so not much different. We drew a box around the managed Active Directory just to segregate it so you can see that it's actually an AWS managed Active Directory. There are some limitations with this, and we're going to talk about those in a second. But here we're showing a trust relationship. You don't have to have one. It's recommended that you have one if your on-premise users need to use like RDS services or QuickSight services or workspace services and stuff like that. But it's simply just another Active Directory in your environment. Any questions? Okay, so I think I talked about a lot of these things already. There needs to be a trust relationship, and everybody understands that authentication flow is opposite of trust relationship. So if I want authentication to flow this way, I need to trust that way. Does that make sense? Okay, so a lot of times customers try to get away with a one-way trust and maybe set it up the incorrect way, but there's also some services out there that need two-way trusts. So just be real careful when you make those decisions on which way you want to go. It's very simple to go and add a second factor or a second direction to your trust relationship, but just make sure you understand the trust relationships. They're required if you want to take your users and use. Remember, this managed Active Directory that we're standing up and managing for you is nothing more than a resource forest. So if you're standing up resources in that forest and you want SSO, or you want your users to be able to use those services at all, there needs to be a trust relationship there. And then to the gentleman's point down here, it's per VPC, the managed Active Directory. So you could see yourself in a situation where I've got my applications segregated by VPCs. I need a lot of them. I need a lot of managed Active Directories, which means I need a lot of trust relationships back home to my on-premises Active Directory. So you can either consolidate all your applications in one VPC, but if you're already down that path, the only option you have, or had, hint, hint, is multiple managed Active Directories. And then the other option here is one per, right? QuickSight Enterprise Edition must be in the same account. All right. So this is a kind of an eye chart. Deployment differences. One is AWS built, 3 clicks and you're in. A little bit of setup, trust relationships, maybe some schema extensions, but really easy. We snap it. We'll do the restores on request. EC2, whether it's synchronized, whether it's replicated, whether it's neither of the two, it's something that you have to manage, right? You have to patch it. You have to back it up. Simple backups using snapshots makes it easy for restore. Then you also have full control over it. And the other thing, too, is these, when you start talking about trust ports from on-premises to the cloud, and you think, well, I have a trust relationship, I have domain controllers, I'm doing replication, or I don't have domain controllers and I'm just doing long-haul authentication, what's the huge difference in the ports and the protocols, right? And from a trust perspective, there are no client-side requirements for things like GPO processing, time. Sometimes there are global catalog requirements. So there are a few number of ports differences when you start talking about where your actual workstations sit and where your actual users sit. But the real change here, and something I want to talk about on my last slide, the real change here is the amount of ports that are required in a dynamic service assignment perspective. So everybody understands the whole nmapper port service, endpoint mapper service in Windows, right? Port 135, doesn't matter what you're doing unless it's a web-based service and you already know it's 80 or 443. You've got to go to 135 and then say, hey, I'm looking for this service. What port am I on? Because as those services start on those individual workstations or servers, they start randomly, right? Before Windows 2008, it was they could start at 1024 to 65.535 TCP UDP. When 2008 came out, they reduced it down to 49.512 to 65.535 TCP UDP for these ports. But the point is that it's still a large number of ports. So when you start talking about firewall rules, you're like, wow, that's a huge number of ports. So there is a significant difference from the client perspective. And as we walk across this, using Amazon Managed Active Directory, it's the least exposed. Trust or replication, it's a little bit different, right? If it's replication, it's typically one port, 389 or maybe 636. And then if you're doing just long-haul authentication, it's client, it's GPO, it's all that stuff. So most people, when they think of this, they think, well, trust relationships or domain join, it's the same amount of ports. It's not. There's a few differences there. Okay, how to select, right? So you're going through this decision-making process and you're trying to figure out which way I should go. And I think that if you're okay with only being an OU admin, if you're okay with not being able to do or require greater permission sets, like trying to install Exchange. So the rule here is that if at any point in the process, either the first time you do an installation of a service like Exchange or SQL or SharePoint, you need domain admin rights, or any time in that process you need domain admin rights, Managed Active Directory is not for you, okay? There are some things that are coming with respect to adjusting those permissions to allow these types of things. We've had long conversations around, good example, customers don't want to build their own ADFS, their Active Directory Federation services. They just want us to build it for them. But in this situation right here, the first ADFS server that you join to a domain has to be run under domain admin rights. So it's essentially, to make a decision which way you go, you really got to understand your requirements. Do I need NetBIOS? Do I need more permissions, right? Okay? Okay, so again, trusts and access. It's that if you ever worked with trust relationships, you're always thinking, well, I need my stuff to go this way, so I need to trust. So this is just kind of a quick teaser here, right? I think the things you want to take away from this is that everybody's familiar with the entitlement process, right? Just because I set up a trust doesn't necessarily mean that someone has access. Like if you stood up the Amazon Managed Active Directory and did a trust relationship two-way with your on-premises directory, we don't have domain admin rights of your Active Directory. And subsequently, any domain admin in your directory doesn't have domain admin rights in the Managed Active Directory until you go through the entitlements process. And the entitlements process is things you do for administrators and for users. Typically, the administration entitlement is for the management of the service and the servers, Active Directory. And the entitlement process for users is, hey, I got a SharePoint site or a SQL server or something that I need to set a permission on for domain users or this group of users, right? Okay? All right, so we're talking about trusts. Everybody know what SID filtering is, right? So I got domain A, domain B. I'm passing a credential from B to A. There's a filter on that says if there are any SIDs in that credential or that access token that were not issued by B, strip them out. That's called SID filtering. Only time you turn off SID filtering is when you're doing migrations for the purposes of SID history. So you can migrate users and migrate resources but not have to go through and reackle all the resources. But once you don't need SID history anymore, you turn SID filtering off. So we recommend domain-wide authentication or selective, depending on what your requirements are, and leave SID filtering turned on. Okay? Everybody familiar with Kerberos forced search order? We talked about the other ones, the other requirements here with respect to ports and the entitlements of users. But you guys familiar with Kerberos forced search order? So I'll try to explain that in 3 minutes and give you guys 10 minutes for questions. Okay? Well, actually, I'll give you probably 8 minutes for questions. I've got one more slide after this. So typically when you build an Active Directory, there's not a lot of forethought in the name of it, right? There's not. Just call it like it is. I've been doing this for a long time. Some use, Game of Thrones. Some use Star Trek. Some are starting to use, the whole Harry Potter thing for naming their domains. But when it comes to publishing applications and services to the enterprise, you get real thoughtful, right? So you may have an Active Directory called abc.com or .ad, some internal name, and that could be the other process, maybe where you have an internal Active Directory name, but an internal namespace an external namespace for your applications. You come along and you have, www.corporate.waycoolthings.com, right? There's a difference between that name and the name that you use to delegate Kerberos constraint delegation and service principal name for that service. There's a difference. And when a client makes a connection to the app, he's going to be asking for, in the process, everybody understands how Kerberos works, right? You authenticate, you get a ticket granting ticket. This is my driver's license. It gets me to the ticket agent. The ticket agent gives me a ticket. And I take it to the gate agent. She says, I don't need to see your driver's license anymore. I have a token from the ticket agent that says, you can board this plane and this is the seat you sit in. So the first process is a ticket grading ticket to verify who you are. And then as you go to these resources to use them, they're going to say, please go get credentials for me. That's a referral process. So you're going to go talk to a domain controller. You're going to say, I'm trying to get to www.waycoolthings.com. And they're going to look through the directory, and it's going to go, The first place it goes, it looks at its own directory. It looks in the directory where the workstation exists. Looks at the directory where the user exists. And it's going to look through there, and it's not going to see it. If it sees it, it's going to go through the Kerberos process, and it's going to give you a session granting ticket or a service granting ticket. It's going to hand it back to you, and you're going to go back to the app, and you're going to present that. And it's an envelope encryption. It's encrypted with the service account or the machine account of that resource. It's going to open it up and look at it and see what things you can do on the app. But if it cannot find it in your directory, if it cannot find that service principal name in the directory that your machine belongs to or you belong to, how does it know where to go? And if you have the trust relation set up correctly, you've got the name suffix routing table, but maybe they're not correct either. Maybe you're using 2 or 3 different names to represent applications within your environment. This Kerberos force search order is a configuration item that you can either do on the client or in Active Directory when it says, I cannot find what you're looking for, but I think you should go look here. And here would be the resource forest. So when you start setting these things up, these are the things you need to be concerned about or considered. Of course, Kerberos forest search order is a huge one. I worked for a federal agency for about 7 years doing this stuff, and there were probably 10 Active Directories that trust one. And how do you get all those guys to know that everything from an enterprise perspective exists in this one resource forest? And this was a godsend for us. Any questions on this? Okay, so my last slide, coming soon to a theater near you. PCI certification, more than 2 domain controllers will give you a choice. Region-wide, right, so no longer VPC specific, I can have a whole region covered by one managed Active Directory, and we are now supporting, or going to be supporting soon, it's not released yet, this is all coming soon. It's LDAP and LDAP-S, S being the one that most people wanted for those secure communications. And we talked about why people need LDAP. Whenever I would work with an app owner and they said I need LDAP, and I'm like, yeah, that's not a good protocol. Because there's no mutual authentication, there's no assurance there. Why aren't you using something like, I can't use Kerberos, I can't use NTLM, well, why aren't you using SAML? A lot of customers still use LDAP, and they want LDAP-S because they don't want that password in the clear. That's coming pretty quickly. So that's all I got, guys. Any questions for me? You got 8 minutes and 45 seconds to, yes? Probably by the end of summer. Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you. You answered my first question about PCI compliance or certification of the user. The second question I have, though, is migrating, and you may have covered it earlier, but when we have Active Directory sort of in our data center, as we migrate to the AWS, we want to take some of those users and migrate them in. We use the managed AD service
So yeah, I mean, that's definitely an approach, or you could just build a Windows on EC2 and just do a DC promo, point it back.
That's the plan we're doing
Okay.
today, but I want to look at, I want to stop managing EC2 servers and let you guys take it.
Oh, okay. Well, just be mindful of some of the limitations around administrative control that we're not giving you. It's a managed service, right? Kind of what I don't know if you guys were here for the previous presentation. When it's a managed service, there's limited amount of control we're going to give you. Okay. Yeah. You want to repeat it kind of loud too?
What about NTP? I mean, do you point NTP to the domain controller?
So that's a good question. So network time, it follows. So a workstation follows, or a server or workstation follows the domain controller that it authenticates with, and that domain controller follows the PDC. Completely honored. When they start up, the first time out, we set the time, but then they go by the operating system, which is windowstime.com or timewindows.com. And after they join the domain, they follow the domain process. Fully honored. So you don't get that Kerberos time skew or nothing like that. But you still have to maintain, it's the PDC emulator it is the one that actually picks up the time. You have to make sure that that's correct. It's a Microsoft thing. Yeah.
I've got a somewhat odd configuration. We've got on-prem domain controllers. We've put some domain controllers in EC2 instances in Amazon, and we want to pick up the managed Active Directory. And then somebody threw in a wonderful sidekick, which is Azure AD Premium.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to build a model where my manage talk to my EC2 instances, and then I dump my on-prem hardware.
Sure.
Because it's aging. But I also want to include Azure, and I'm finding nobody doing that.
Yeah. Maybe we should talk offline. I will tell you this, though. Azure Active Directory Premium is not a Kerberos-based directory. And that's probably all I want to talk about on recording. We can talk about it afterwards. Anybody else? Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So when we started out, we were nervous, right? So we started with a read-only domain controller.
Yeah.
After a while, you needed to be able to do it. So we promoted it. But do you see a reason to ever do a read-only domain controller?
So if you knew my background, you'd know why I'm going to say this, and I'll share it with you offline. No. I think that first of all, there are reasons why you would use a read-only domain controller. Security reasons, right? Maybe it's under someone's desk and you're not really confident that it's not going to walk away, and someone could, grab the hash files and know everybody's password. Well, they wouldn't know the password because it's a one-time hash. But if you know that password, that's lateral credential theft. That is your owned. So yeah, I mean, read-only domain controllers, BitLocker. We do EBS, elastic block storage, encryption. No one's going to walk away with your domain controllers on AWS. Security groups. I mean, we could completely secure those things. I think having read-only domain controllers, and I've had this conversation many times with customers, and I leave them with this. No, go talk to Microsoft and make them convince you why you should use them. They're more hassle than they're worth. That's my opinion. What's that?
We ended up upgrading ours to a full domain controller.
Yeah, and that's what most people end up doing. So people think, wow, geez, I'm in the cloud, it's not secure, and it's absolutely secure. FedRAMP high. I mean, we can secure the cloud just as well as you can secure on premises. So that's no longer or it should never have been, but it's definitely not a reason to use read-only domain controllers. Now, if you're saying, earlier I was talking about near-edge scenarios, right? If you have a near-edge scenario, yeah, a read-only domain controller is not a bad idea, right? But no, go ahead. No, this is not in GovCloud yet, and it's not FedRAMPed yet. So there's a difference, right? The whole CONUS footprint is all the regions in the U.S. are mod, and GovCloud is high. It's not a FedRAMPed service in the non-GovCloud regions either. Anything else? Okay, one more time. I can't hear you. No, so I'm glad you asked that question because I kind of breezed over it. There are complex, so it supports SQL, but not always on availability groups, right? So there are complex scenarios in SharePoint deployments that it won't support. But yes, it supports the deployment of SharePoint without a doubt. But the more complex you get, HA, your SharePoint admin, are you doing specific OU queries? Are you doing base queries? That's where it gets a little tricky. But yeah, it'll support SharePoint, just not the complex scenarios. Anybody else? Okay, well, thank you very much, guys.